My daughter was supposed to get married on a Saturday in September. The kind of September morning we get in Nova Scotia, maybe once every few years. Clear sky. The maples just starting to turn, that particular quality of light that makes everything look like it's been painted rather than real. She'd picked the date 18 months earlier, circled it on the calendar in my kitchen with a red marker, and every time I walked past that calendar after that, I'd feel this low, warm hum of anticipation. Then, the Friday night before, she found me alone on the back deck of the inn, where the wedding party was staying. And she told me something that made me set down my glass very carefully on the railing, because I didn't trust my hands. "Dad," she said, "I need you to look at something, and I need you to tell me I'm not losing my mind." She wasn't losing her mind. I should start at the beginning. That's what my late wife always said I was bad at. I'd walk into a room and start talking from the middle of a story, and she'd have to stop me and say, "Graham, from the top, please." So, from the top. My daughter Fiona is 34 years old, a physiotherapist who runs her own clinic in Dartmouth. She's smart the way her mother was smart, quietly without making a performance of it. She reads people well, or I thought she did. It turned out that loving someone rearranges everything, including the instincts you'd trust with your life. She met her fiancé at a conference in Halifax 2 winters ago. His name was Derek Paulson. He was a financial advisor, he said, independent, mostly working with mid-sized businesses on investment portfolios. He was 41, never married, lean in that deliberate way that suggested the gym was part of an image rather than a habit. He had a handshake that was just slightly too firm, the kind where you could tell someone had practiced it. I noticed that handshake the first time Fiona brought him home for dinner. I noticed other things too, but I kept them to myself. I had no evidence. I had 63 years of watching people, 30 of which I'd spent as a structural engineer running my own firm, where reading a contractor's intentions was sometimes the difference between a building that stood and one that didn't. But none of that amounts to proof. It amounts to a feeling in the sternum, a low and steady discomfort, the kind you can't explain to someone who's in love without sounding like you're the problem. So I watched. Derek asked about my work within the first 20 minutes. I told him I was retired. He asked what I'd done. I said engineering, some project management toward the end. He nodded, glanced around my house the way you look at a car to price it before you make an offer. The bookshelves, the original Maud Lewis print on the wall, a gift from my wife 28 years ago, purchased before Lewis became what she became. The house itself, which I bought in 1991 when the south end of Halifax still had some give in it. "You must have done well for yourself," he said. It wasn't quite a compliment. It was an appraisal. "I did all right," I said. "We were careful with money." He smiled. "Careful is one strategy. There are smarter ones." Fiona laughed, touched his arm. She thought he was being clever. I thought he was telling me exactly who he was, the way some people do in the first 10 minutes if you're paying attention. After they left that evening, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. My housekeeper, Paulette, who has worked for me since my wife passed, and who treats candor as a form of affection, came in to finish cleaning up. "You got that face," she said. "What face?" "The one where you've already decided something and you're trying to talk yourself out of it." I didn't say anything. "She's happy," Paulette said, not as a counter-argument, as information. "I know she is," I said. "That's the part that worries me. I am not the kind of man who acts on instinct alone. I spent 3 decades in a field where instinct without documentation will get people killed. So 2 weeks after that dinner, I called a man named Ted Arsenault. Ted and I had gone to Dalhousie together. He'd gone into law, eventually moved into private investigation after an early retirement that he never fully explained. We'd stayed in loose contact, the way you do with people you genuinely like but rarely see. He picked up on the second ring. "Ted," I said, "I have something I need looked into." "Quietly. It's always quiet with you, Graham," he said. "What's her name?" I gave him Derek's name instead. He didn't react to that. In his line of work, it didn't surprise him that the threat was rarely who you expected. The engagement happened 6 weeks later. Fiona called me on a Sunday morning. Voice lit up in a way I hadn't heard since her mother's better days. I told her I was happy for her. I meant the part about wanting her to be happy. I was less certain about the rest. Ted's preliminary findings arrived shortly after. Derek Paulson had declared personal bankruptcy in 2019. He owed the CRA, Canada Revenue Agency, over $90,000 in back taxes, a file that was still active. His financial advisory practice was registered in New Brunswick, not Nova Scotia, and had no verifiable client list, no office address, no professional registration with any provincial securities commission. He had been sued in small claims court 3 times in Ontario. He had an ex-common law partner in Waterloo who had taken out a restraining order in 2021. None of this technically was a crime in the present tense. People have bad financial histories. Relationships collapse. I'd made mistakes in my 40s that I was glad weren't on public record. What made me set the folder down and open the window to get some air was the pattern Ted described. 2 previous women, both successful professionals, both with established assets. The first, a pharmacist in Kingston, had lent Derek money during their relationship, money that was never repaid and which she'd written off rather than fight for after he left. The second was worse. A dentist in Ottawa. They'd gotten engaged. She'd refinanced her house to cover wedding costs and a deposit on a condo they were buying together. The engagement ended a month before the wedding. He had access to joint accounts she'd set up in anticipation of the marriage and withdrawn nearly all of it before she knew the relationship was over. That dentist had tried to warn people online. Derek's lawyer had sent her a cease and desist. I kept all of this in a folder in my desk drawer. I did not tell Fiona. I had one chance to do this right, and if I moved too early, with evidence she could dismiss as a controlling father's obsession, I would lose her, maybe lose her for good. I knew how this kind of thing went. When someone has chosen a person, the last thing they want is a reason to unchose them. The mind resists. It finds alternate explanations. It turns on the messenger. So I watched. And I waited. And I paid Ted to keep watching. In the meantime, Derek became a regular presence. He had a way of making himself useful that I recognized from my business years as a form of access management. He drove Fiona to appointments. He inserted himself into family decisions. He started appearing at my house with her, always cheerful, always finding small ways to reference money, the value of things, investment opportunities, the wisdom of liquidity in older age. One Sunday in February, he pulled me aside after dinner. "Graham," he said with the warmth of a man who has practiced warmth, "now that Fiona and I are getting married, I want to make sure you're taken care of. Financially, I mean. A man your age, assets tied up in property and old equities. There's a smarter way to structure things. I've got relationships with some people in private lending. Some instruments the banks don't advertise that could easily double your annual return." I looked at him for a moment. "That's very thoughtful," I said. "Family looks after family," he said. "We do," I agreed. 3 days later, I called Ted and said, "Everything. I need everything you have." The full report took 2 weeks. It confirmed what I'd feared and added things I hadn't imagined. Derek had a half-sister named Allison who acted, functionally, as a partner in these schemes. She would appear in the lives of his targets under different pretexts, a colleague, a casual friend, and begin building a separate relationship. Her role, as Ted reconstructed it from sworn statements by 2 previous victims, was to create a second point of trust and to help manage the extraction phase. She was already in contact with Fiona, Ted noted. They'd met at a yoga class 3 months earlier. Fiona had mentioned her to me once as a woman from my class, really lovely. Allison had been in Fiona's life for 3 months. I had not known she was Derek's half-sister. The extraction plan, as Ted pieced it together from financial forensics and conversations with Derek's previous victims, had a predictable structure. Create emotional and financial dependency. Get the target to commingle assets. Joint account. Co-signed lease. Shared investment vehicle. Create a crisis, usually manufactured, that required a rapid transfer of funds. disappear, or in marriage cases, remain long enough to establish legal claim to shared assets before separation. The wedding was set for September. We were in July. I sat with this information for 4 days. I thought about my wife, who had trusted people completely and been right about them almost without exception. I thought about Fiona at 12, sitting in a hospital room holding her mother's hand. I thought about the dentist in Ottawa who had lost her house. Then I did what I'd done every time in my career when the situation was complex and the stakes were real. I made a plan, not a reactive one, a prepared one. The first call was to my solicitor, a woman named Janet who had handled my firm's legal work for 15 years and who did not flinch at unusual requests. I need you at a specific location on a specific date, I told her, because I'm going to prevent a marriage and I need a legal witness for everything that follows. The second call was to Ted. Can your contact at the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit receive what you have? He said he could. He said they'd likely been building their own file. The third call was to my son, Fiona's brother Patrick, who lived in Vancouver and who I'd kept out of this entirely until now. He booked a flight that evening. I did not sleep well in the weeks that followed, but I was not uncertain. The rehearsal dinner was held at a restored heritage inn outside Wolfville, in the Annapolis Valley. It was the kind of venue that costs more because of the exposed beams and the antique lighting than because of anything it actually provides. And it had been Fiona's choice. Or rather, it had been Fiona's choice, guided steadily in this direction by Derek, who had a gift for making his preferences feel like yours. The bill for the venue and the surrounding wedding costs had come to just over $80,000, which Fiona had largely covered herself, draining her savings and taking a short-term loan she didn't entirely want to discuss. The dinner itself was pleasant, in the way that performances are pleasant, everyone playing their assigned role. Derek was charming. Allison was warm, sitting near Fiona, touching her arm at easy intervals, the way you do when you've built deliberate intimacy. I watched it all and kept my expression where it needed to be. I was standing near the edge of the terrace, listening to someone from Derek's side of the guest list tell me about the drive up from Truro when I felt a hand close around my arm. It was Fiona. "Dad," she said, "I need to talk to you right now." We found a corner of the garden, away from the lanterns and the noise. Her hands were shaking. She'd been crying recently. Not visibly now, but I could tell. "I borrowed Derek's tablet this afternoon," she said. "Mine's been slow. He left it on the charger in our room." She paused. "He has a shared notes app with Allison. It wasn't locked." She showed me the screen. I read it without moving. The notes were meticulous. Fiona's assets were listed, her clinic's estimated value, her savings account balance, the equity in her condo. There was a note that said joint account by end of month 2, access established. There was a phrase I recognized from Ted's report, almost verbatim. Liquidity, event Q1, and there was a section about me, my estimated property value, my company's sale, which Ted had traced through public records in which Derek had clearly done the same. My approximate net worth, which was substantially higher than I had ever indicated to anyone, a line that read, "F doesn't know about the portfolio." Approach through her after wedding. Capacity concerns if necessary. Consult OW on timeline. Capacity concerns, the same language used in the Ottawa case, where an elderly father had been moved into care after a court order Derek had helped manufacture. My name was in these notes. They had plans for me. Fiona looked at me the way she'd looked at me in the hospital the night before her mother died, when she was old enough to understand what was coming, but young enough to need me to tell her what to do. "Tell me what I'm reading," she said. I put my hand on her shoulder. "You're reading exactly what you think you're reading. How long have you known?" "Long enough," I said. "I was waiting for the right moment. I didn't want to lose you." She made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Then she straightened. "What do we do?" "Tonight," I said. "You go back in there. You have dinner," you smile. "Can you do that?" "I'm a good physiotherapist," she said. "I've helped people learn to walk after strokes." I think I can get through a dinner. That's my daughter. I stayed on the terrace after she went back inside. Above the valley, the sky was enormous and very dark, and the stars were the kind you only see when you're far enough from the city to remember they exist. I finished my drink. I thought about the dentist in Ottawa. I thought about what capacity concerns meant when applied to a 63-year-old man who had built his own firm and was still playing squash twice a week. Then I went to find Patrick, who had flown across the country and was waiting at the bar with the expression of a man who had been holding his patients by the collar for 2 hours. Tomorrow, I told him. Tell me what you need, he said. That night, I made 3 calls, one to Janet, confirming she would be there by 9. One to Ted, who told me the RCMP file was further along than he'd indicated earlier, and that if I was prepared to go public, the timing was favorable. And one to a journalist at the Chronicle Herald who had written a long piece on elder financial abuse 18 months earlier and who had, at the time, told me off the record that she was certain there were active schemes she hadn't been able to name publicly yet. She answered on the first ring. "Graham," she said, "if you have names, I want to be there." I told her where to be and when. Morning came the way mornings do when you haven't slept, suddenly and with too much light. I was at the inn at 8:30. Janet arrived with a junior associate. Ted arrived with documentation printed and organized in a way I recognized as someone who had testified before and knew what format held up. Patrick was already there, standing straight in a way he hadn't since his hockey years, which meant he was nervous. The ceremony was scheduled for 11. Guests began arriving at 10. I watched Derek move through them laughing, hand on backs, the ease of a man who considered the situation managed. Allison was near the entrance greeting people, a studied version of warmth. Neither of them looked my way with any particular concern. I walked to the front of the ceremony space at 10:45. The officiant saw me coming and moved toward me. I told her quietly and pleasantly that there would be a brief announcement before the ceremony and that it was coordinated with the family. She stepped aside. I took the microphone stand and turned to face the rows of guests. "Good morning. I'm Fiona's father, Graham, and I need a few minutes of your time before we begin." Heads turned. Derek's smile held for a second, then recalibrated into something more watchful. "This wedding will not be taking place today. I know that's not what any of you came here for, and I apologize for your mourning. What I can tell you is why." A sound moved through the room. Not quite noise, not quite silence. Fiona came to me last night with information she discovered on her own. I want to be clear about that. My daughter, not me. She found notes on a shared device, a detailed plan between Derek and his half-sister Allison to access and extract her financial assets, beginning in the first weeks of the marriage. I looked at Derek, and there were plans that extended to me as well. Notes about my property, my investment history, my cognitive capacity. Derek stepped forward. "Graham, this is a serious allegation." "It's a documented one," I said. "Ted Arsenault, who has been investigating you since February, has compiled records that have been shared with the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit. He's here this morning. Janet Ogilvy, my solicitor, is also present. And I want to be very clear that this is not a misunderstanding." Allison had moved quietly toward the side exit. Patrick stepped into her path without being asked. "That's the thing about sons. Sometimes they know exactly when to stop talking and stand somewhere. This has happened before," I continued. "There are previous victims, a pharmacist in Kingston, a dentist in Ottawa who lost her home. Others, if any of you have a connection to Derek Paulson that you have concerns about, Ted Arsenault is here and will speak to you privately." Derek turned to the room with the last tool he had left. "Fiona, you don't believe this. Tell them you don't believe this." Fiona was standing near the back of the ceremony space, beside her brother. She looked at Derek with the particular expression of a woman who has passed through every stage of something in a single night and arrived at a place of cold clarity. "I found the notes myself, Derek," she said. "You left the app open." He looked at Allison. She was not looking at him. The rest of the morning was not quiet. There were RCMP officers present by 11:15. Derek attempted two separate explanations that contradicted each other. Allison retained a composure that impressed even Ted, which he mentioned to me afterward with what sounded almost like professional respect. The guests mostly stayed, some out of concern for Fiona, some because human beings are fundamentally curious, and a few, I suspected, because the reception catering was prepaid and they didn't see the point in wasting it. The journalist from the Chronicle Herald arrived at 11:30. I gave her 20 minutes of my time in a quiet room off the main hall, while Janet sat beside me and occasionally clarified a legal point. I told the journalist I would speak at length after the proceedings were settled. She said that was fine. She was already filing notes on her phone. Patrick drove Fiona and me home that afternoon. The Annapolis Valley in September is genuinely beautiful. I'd forgotten that, in all the noise of the preceding months. We drove through it mostly without talking, which was fine. Silence between people who know each other well is rarely emptiness. At some point, Fiona said, "I keep thinking about the yoga class." "The yoga class," I said. "That's where I met Allison. Derek suggested I try that class specifically. He said a colleague had recommended it." She paused. "He placed her there." "Yes. 3 months. I thought she was just a person I liked. I didn't have a way to make that better. What I could offer was accurate. She was very practiced. This was not your failure of perception. These were professionals." "I know," she said, "but knowing doesn't close the gap between what you understand and what you feel." I know that from experience. "Why didn't you ever tell me about the company?" she said after a while. When I'd sold my engineering firm in 2009, I'd been deliberately quiet about the amount. I'd invested it, lived on the returns, and continued to present myself as comfortably retired rather than what I actually was. "Because I wanted you to build your clinic on your own terms," I said. "I didn't want you working for the inheritance. I wanted you working for the work." "And Derek would have known," she said. "Not from me," I said, "but from property records, company filings. These things can be found." She was quiet for a few kilometers. "He was planning to have you declared incompetent," she said. "It wasn't the question. That was the plan they'd used before. It takes time. It requires cooperation, usually from a spouse. That's what the timeline in the notes referred to." She put a hand over her face for a moment. Then she took it away. "Okay," she said. "Okay." That's how she's always been in a crisis. She goes quiet. She goes somewhere internal. Then she comes back and says okay, which doesn't mean she's fine. It means she's decided to be functional, which is sometimes all you can ask of a person. In the months that followed, the legal proceedings moved at the pace such things move in this country, which is to say, methodically and without drama. Derek and Allison were charged under the criminal code with fraud over $5,000, conspiracy to commit fraud, and in Allison's case, a separate charge relating to her role in the Ottawa situation, which the RCMP had been investigating independently. They were both released on conditions, then rearrested the following spring when evidence emerged of an additional scheme in British Columbia they'd been running concurrently. Janet filed the civil suit. We did not expect to recover anything substantial. Derek's actual assets, once examined, amounted to very little beyond a leased car and some gym equipment. But the public judgment was the point. A searchable record. A permanent answer to anyone who Googled his name. The dentist in Ottawa contacted me through Ted in November. She had spent 2 years trying to warn people and had been legally silenced. She wept on the phone in a way that made me feel the weight of the years she'd carried it. I told her that her case was part of the record now, properly documented, and that her warning had effectively reached people, just by a different route. "It shouldn't have taken this long," she said. "No," I agreed. "It shouldn't have." I gave a statement to the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre. I attended 2 hearings and testified at one. I found, to my mild surprise, that I did not feel angry in any sustained way. Anger takes energy that I preferred to spend elsewhere. What I felt was more like a clean, functional resolve. The same feeling I'd had when a contractor on a project in my early 30s had tried to falsify load-bearing documentation, and I had simply gathered my evidence and removed him from the project. You do what needs doing. The emotion is secondary. Fiona, however, was angry for quite a long time. Rightfully. I did not try to talk her out of it. Anger is appropriate data. It tells you something true about what was done to you, and she had every right to feel it fully before she set it down. By the following spring, she had set most of it down. She was seeing someone new, not a formal relationship yet, just a person she'd mentioned a few times with a specific quality of understatement that I recognized, a man named Callum, who worked with Parks Canada, and who had, apparently, never once asked about her clinic's revenue or the value of her condo. She mentioned this to me somewhat pointedly. "How does he respond to your stories?" I asked. Her mother had always said that was the tell, what a person did when you told them something that had happened to you. Fiona thought about it. "He asks follow-up questions," she said, "about the person in the story, not about what it cost." "Good," I said. "You'd like him," she said. "Bring him for dinner," I said. "I'll make the chowder." It was Paulette's recipe technically, but Paulette had taught me years ago, which I consider equivalent. The Jasper Lewis print is still on my wall in the front room. When Fiona comes for dinner, which is most Sundays now, she sometimes stops in front of it the way her mother used to, not saying anything in particular, just looking. Her mother had bought it for $40 at a craft fair in Mahone Bay in 1994, before anyone had fully understood what Maud Lewis's work would become. She bought it because she liked it. That was the whole calculation. That's how you know something's real. I've come to believe, not because someone told you it was valuable, because you were drawn to it before you knew. Derek was convicted the following October. Allison took a plea in early November. I read both verdicts on my phone sitting on my deck on a Tuesday morning, with coffee going cold in the cup beside me and the harbor doing what the harbor does, indifferent and unchanged. I texted Fiona. She texted back, "Good." Then she sent a second message. "Callum wants to know if your chowder offer still stands." I said it did. That Sunday, the three of us sat at my kitchen table while Paulette pretended not to eavesdrop from the hallway, and the October light came through the windows the same way it had for 30 years, and I thought about my wife, who would have talked to Callum for 45 minutes about his work in the national parks, and somehow extracted his entire autobiography by the time dessert arrived, because she had a gift for that, for making people feel that what they did and who they were was genuinely interesting. I don't have that gift the way she did, but I am a good listener, and I can ask a decent question. It's a start. Some chapters close completely. The ones worth keeping, you carry forward. There's a moment I keep returning to, not the one of the ceremony, not the verdicts, not even the phone call from the dentist in Ottawa. It's a smaller moment. Fiona on the terrace, her hands shaking, showing me a tablet screen in the dark. The look on her face wasn't panic. It was something quieter and more painful than that. It was the look of someone realizing they had trusted completely, and that the trust had been treated as a resource to be mined. What Derek and Allison built wasn't just a financial scheme. It was a careful, patient dismantling of someone's ability to trust their own judgment. That's the part people don't always name when they talk about fraud. The money can sometimes be recovered. The confidence in your own perception that takes longer. I've thought a great deal about why it worked as long as it did. Fiona is not naive. She reads people well. But she was also, at 34, genuinely ready to love someone, and that readiness was the opening Derek needed. He didn't manufacture her feelings. He found them and built a false door inside them. That's a different kind of harm. It requires something closer to intelligence than we usually want to credit to people who do wrong. A cold, applied understanding of how good people work. Which is why I don't think patience alone stopped him. It was patience built on something. I'd spent 3 decades learning that structures fail not because people are careless, but because they stop asking whether what they're seeing is actually what they're. You develop a practice of verification. You don't take load-bearing claims on faith. That habit, carried into the rest of life, is what let me sit with discomfort for 8 months without either acting prematurely or doing nothing. There is a discipline in that. It isn't glamorous. It doesn't feel like strength in the moment. It feels like waiting in the dark, but it is a form of strength, the kind that doesn't announce itself. And what Fiona showed, in the end, was something I hadn't fully anticipated. When she came to find me on that terrace, she wasn't asking me to rescue her. She had already done the hardest part herself. She found the evidence, she processed what it meant, and she came to me not for a decision, but for backup. That's not weakness. That's someone who knows when to act alone, and when to ask for help, and who has the steadiness to tell the difference under pressure. That's a quality that doesn't come from circumstance. It's built slowly from every difficult thing a person has moved through and refused to be flattened by. I think about the cause and the effect of all of it, not in any mystical sense, but in the plainest possible way. Derek and Allison spent years treating people's trust as a mechanism to be exploited. The effect, eventually, was that their entire structure of deception collapsed under the weight of its own documentation. They were meticulous planners who forgot that other people can also be meticulous. They underestimated Fiona. They underestimated me. And that underestimation was not bad luck. It was the direct consequence of seeing other human beings primarily as instruments. What I hope Fiona carries forward, what I hope anyone who hears this carries forward, is simply this: that good character and clear thinking and the willingness to act on what you know are not separate virtues. They hold each other up. You can't reason your way to a right decision if you're unwilling to face what the reasoning shows you. You can't hold your ground if you don't know what you're standing for. And none of it matters if you fold the moment it becomes costly. Fiona didn't fold. Neither did the dentist in Ottawa, who kept trying to warn people for years while legally silenced, which is its own kind of courage. Some people confuse patience with passivity. They're almost opposites. Patience is what you practice when you know what you're doing and you're waiting for the right conditions. Passivity is what happens when you've decided the situation is out of your hands. That terrace. The dark valley. My daughter standing there, steadier than she knew. That's the part I keep.